the camera layer. Whenever you're working in a 3D scene, moving 2D layers within a 3D space, or a 2.5D scene, if you will, intended to replicate the behaviors of a physical camera, their actions and the movements of that physical cameras. So we can create one or several cameras, right click and new, then choose a new camera, which will make this panel of camera settings pop up. From the default settings, there are a few more fine adjustment possibilities. There are two different types of cameras, the 2-node and the 1-node. And to understand the difference, let's start with creating a 1-node camera and name it Camera Layer 1-node. The 1-node camera, it functions a little bit more like a real physical camera, and it orients around itself. Like whenever trying to use the Orbit Around cursor tool up here from the toolbar, replacing the camera view to default or a custom view. Marking the camera layer in the timeline, which I made as a 2-node camera, we have a new property called Point of Interest under Transform. And with a little point or anchor in the middle of the text. Now that we use the same tool, it may orbit or circle around with a different type of movement, and using that point of interest instead. You might want to try to use the 2-node camera for whenever you're having a little bit more complex movement in the scene, or you want a little bit more flexibility to the movement, and wherever you have simpler adjustments with just an easy movement, it might be worth checking out using only the 1-node camera. Then to upgrade a 1-node camera to a 2-node, just go up to Layer and Transform, going into Auto Orient, then choose the Orient towards Point of Interest, which is actually the only difference between the two cameras as well. With the 2-node camera you have another point of interest to it that gives a little bit more flexibility. I will add another view to the default view just to see the transform movement a bit better. And similar to what we've seen before, change the point of interest down here, adjusting the numbers for X, Y and Z. Or just move it directly inside the composition here. Move the position as well for the actual camera. And just as with the lights before, change the orientation with X, Y and Z rotation here as well. Under camera options, the zoom will be changeable, and watching the zoom effect there, while in the other, view how the zoom kind of moves or focus back and forward in 3D space. Then double click on one of the camera layers and go back into the settings. Let's see how any changes here to the settings will affect the live camera. Under preset, there's 9 different ones of alternatives ranging from 15mm up to 200mm, intended to replicate the behavior of a real camera, and in this case a 35mm camera. Plus we got the custom one, as when manual changes are done to any of the 4 settings here in the middle, which are film size, the zoom, the focal length and also the angle of view. Which might then or can also be saved for later use if you want to use it later on the same settings. When changing the focal length, we also automatically change the zoom in millimeter up here, together with the angle of view in degrees here in the middle, as they are all connected together, meaning that you can change the settings and amount using any of the 3 as a base measure for your camera. And now the focal length measures the distance from the film plane, or the actual sensor in the back of the camera, where the lights hit and creates the focused image, and over or up to the nodal point. A nodal point is this little circle or point in the middle where the light from the outside converges, or with other words, it intersects or meets together. So when we are decreasing the focal length, we get a wider view of the scene and less zooming in, while if we're increasing it, the opposite effect is happening with a more narrow scene, so more zoomed in and a smaller angle of view. Then the film size, indicated in millimeter, is the size of the actual film plane or sensor, and most often it should be best to just keep this one at the default at 36 millimeter. And some people will actually argue here that there's no point of changing this one at all, as there's no physical limitations with this synthetic camera, if you will. And although, as it's actually there might be some kind of reason to actually be able to match up the film size with the real physical camera. Moving on to some of the other alternatives, we got the units to set in either current millimeters, pixels, or inches, depending a little bit there on your preferences. There's actually an option to adjust the film size in further detail as well, even though mentioned that we might even need it. Or do we? Either by changing it as now, horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. But here again, if it's actually worth paying any attention to it, I'm not fully sure of, so let me know in the comments down below if you actually make sense of it or actually make use of the purpose of it that you can't use with any other type of options. Then at the moment, we currently see the preview mode, as that option is checked. And just uncheck this one if you don't want to see the live updates. There's a few more options over in this area, but they're currently grayed out. And this is because we're not in the classic renderer, so let's change it to that one. Back into our camera settings, we're now able to click on and off the enable depth of field, and giving a few more adjustments for this renderer. It becomes possible to adjust the focus distance separately, either moving it further away from the line, indicating the composition size, or closer to the camera. The option called lock to zoom gives us the ability to keep focus distance correlating or following the amount of zoom, so the text or object always will be in focus. Well, as long as the zoom indicated by this line is over at or matching the object's position. However though, if turning it off, we can zoom in and out while choosing to be in or out of focus. Potentially used for some type of nice effects and perhaps extend the blur a little bit when zooming out from an image. Although here when we're working with the focus distance for a layer, it might be quite easy to get lost a bit on where you're actually having the focus for a layer or object. So a little hack here can be to mark the camera layer together with that layer you want in focus. Go to Layer, Camera, then set focus distance to layer. Aperture may be changed to increase or decrease the size of the lens opening, while increasing it also makes the blur of the depth of field a bit more noticeable. Aperture is also related to and correlate with the f-stop value, giving the same type of effect, but it basically means the representation of focal length to aperture ratio. The blur might be manipulated directly on the blur level property, giving anything from 0% blur and all the way up to roughly 1000% before it's blown out completely. And in here we actually get a few bonus adjustments to the camera's iris or the lens, and some highlight options when working in the classic 3D renderer compared to if we're working in the other two different renderers. Then back in the timeline under the camera options, instead of just having zoom here as before, there are now the options you saw before in the camera settings, like a switch for the depth of field, you got the focus distance, the aperture, and the blur level, plus some extra ones we haven't seen before. Though as these options are identical to the ones using the camera lens blur effect, and that one giving a little bit more extra options, a little bit more splash of spices, if you will. And we can see the effects a little bit easier, why I also think it's actually easier to control that one. Let's go for that one instead. Let's use our group panels to the right, go to Effects and Presets, then search for Camera Lens Blur, and I will drag it on top of my chosen image, but if you want the same effect on several images, consider adding it to an adjustment layer instead. Now, under the blur radius, having the same 5 different adjustments for the iris or camera lens, together with the 3 options for the highlights. Sometimes there might be reasons such as more separate control to put it directly on the layer while using the camera lens blur effect, but it also adds some extra weight to a squeaking computer in pain, if you will, and it also drags down the renderer speed quite a lot if you're going to add it on each layer individually, while instead adjusting it directly on the camera might give a little bit more coherent or natural look as you're zooming through the composition, but it's all a little bit dependent on your type of style or preference and depending on the project, what you choose. To watch the difference a little bit more clearly, let's dig into the effect directly on the layer, starting with dragging up the blur radius to about 10. Then with the shape, we can check out how all the stars in the image will move from being triangles to squares, pentagon, got the hexagon, heptagon, octagon, nonagon, and lastly, decagon. Roundness lets us change the amount between 0 to 100% to affect the shape. The aspect ratio used to either contract or make the blur thinner down to 0, or drag it all the way up against 100 to widen the blur to the very maximum. Rotation let us rotate or turn around the small blur shapes. We have the diffraction fringe, setting it between any of the value between 0 and up all the way to 500, giving the look of a darker center and brighter edges, representing a slight interference pattern of bright and dark bands as when light or waves pass through a very narrow opening, just as an aperture in the camera. To then smooth it out and balance it a bit, drag up the roundness if necessary. Other than that, you can always play around a little bit with the highlight or adding some gain up to 100, and thereby adding brightness in relation or dependent of the amount of threshold, which in turn can be set between 0 and 1, and is the luminosity or brightness limit, where 0 boosts any pixel with a brightness above 0, and 1 takes all normal highlights away. Finally, the saturation also works together and are adjusted with the gain, while it's related to the coloring or decoloring of the layer. 0 will push the colors against the white, and 100 tries to retain all coloring. But let's say that we want to change the camera a little bit with the orbit around cursor tool for this layer after we actually put it in the 3D space. So right click the layer, camera, and create camera from 3D view. Then turning on the text layers to 3D as well and extending the basic camera layer to this point. Now showing as the top of the hierarchy, it will have the same camera angle as the Photoshop layer have. It might be really useful when you're having several type of different cameras with different type of angles in different type of compositions, and perhaps you want to view one camera angle in one composition as the same view as you have in another one, then you can do that quickly by using this type of tool. I will just create a quick and basic camera movement for this one. So keyframing the point of interest and the position of the camera. Then use the tools to move in the camera, the orbit around, create this orbiting or kind of spinning movement around a curved path by adjusting the position to constrain horizontally, only orbiting sideways, or we might want to constrain vertically and just orbit up or down instead. Then the pan under combines the position and point of interest to make it move sideways and up or down, while the dolly towards cursor tool lets us adjust the perception of depth, going a bit closer or further away from objects. Whenever you're working with 3D and using a camera for any type of project, you want to know the following 3 shortcuts. Switch to Orbit Camera Tool, press 1, to the Pan Camera Control, press 2, and finally the Dolly Camera Control 3 to just quickly swap between these 3 ones. Very nice. Having marked this activate option, the left, middle, right mouse click for camera navigation will deactivate temporary wireframe mode. Camera manipulation point may be set to none, indicator, or directional indicator. For camera navigation dolly, just tweaking the mouse scroll wheel behavior to magnify the composition. The dolly camera or reverse dolly camera. Then it's drag direction to either normal or the reverse. Then we're off to the create orbit null. Let's throw in another view from the top. Now, instead of orbit, now we're able to control the camera separately. For example, with easier control for the rotation as the camera is parented to the null. Then with the null positioned at the point of interest, it will rotate in a perfect circle around the object. This can be a really nice thing to have in your toolbox whenever you are trying to create more complicated or complex type of camera movement, or you have many separated movements connected to different null objects. We got the create cameras from 3D model. With this one, it's supposed to, or at least it says on the Adobe user guide, that you're supposed to be able to extract the camera data from a 3D program, just like Blender or some other similar things. For example, when using an GLTF file or an LGB file. But I just couldn't get this to function myself, and I asked in the community forums, and no one really seemed to know about this effect. So it might be one of those that's actually up and coming, if you will. But for now, I just couldn't get it to work. But if you manage to get it to work and function, so please let me know in the comments. In the next scene and composition, I created a few objects placed in different positions of the depth or the set value. So with the top view, seeing the camera, which I will make sure that the depth of field is set to on. So by changing the position here of the camera, either by going back or forward, the object will become blurry and a little bit out of focus. A possible solution for this is to go into camera and link focus distance to point of interest, and this giving us the ability to change and to animate the position while still keeping a constant focus on a specific object or part of the scene with a point of interest. By marking the camera and another layer together, you can go into the camera again and choose the link focus distance to layer, and that focus distance on the camera will now always be following and adapting to that movement of the layer and always keeping in focus. We can set focus distance to layer, and we've gone through this one before, so nothing on that. But the last option here is pretty much just a basic camera reset for any type of changes you've done and want to go back to the default.